going down through chapter 5, verse 6. This seems to be unified material. We'll talk about this in just a sec. Maybe not at first glance. It seems as though, in some regards, you begin in James 4:11, you kind of have three disjointed or unrelated paragraphs. They're distinct paragraphs, they're distinct thoughts in each of these sections. But we find ourselves asking some of those same questions that we've talked about before. Why is he putting it here? What's the link between the two? Is he just kind of jumping around and doing scattershot thoughts, whatever comes into his mind? As before, we've seen that really isn't ever the case. There's always some kind of fabric linking the two together, and I think that will continue here in James 4, beginning in verse 11, and going down through about chapter 5 and verse 6. To look at these three distinct paragraphs at first, just kind of a general overview of what we have. Verses 11 and 12, we find an admonition against, the New King James says, speaking evil of one another, or speaking against one another, defaming, slandering. You get different translations, but we get the general sense. Speaking evil of a brother and judging his brother is what he is warning against in those two verses. Then verses 13 through 17 here in chapter 4 is the warning against a kind of presumption, boasting about tomorrow, and ordering out every hour of your life as though that is what you will have, and there's nothing that could possibly contravene that, and living in without view of God, living without a thought for His power and what He wills and what He wants, but instead boasting in your arrogance, as he says in verse 16. Then in chapter 5, the idea that starts that chapter is the boasting and the oppression of the rich, the wealthy, those who are harming the people around them and have defrauded others and have really kind of violently enacted their plans and schemes against others. And he says that you are condemned, you've murdered the just. So, again, three ideas that may not immediately appear linked together, but we can observe some commonalities between the three. In all three of these sections, you see a reference to or some kind of emphasis placed upon human weakness or frailty. When he's talking about judging a brother, it comes in the form of this sort of rhetorical question in verse 12, who are you to judge another? By the way, this human weakness or human frailty is compared to, contrasted against, in each of these sections, the power, the divine authority and might, overwhelming power of God. And so that's the thought there in verses 11 and 12. God is the lawgiver. He is the one who can save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? You are not him. He is here, you are down here. This is a very different view that we have of these two parties. When he's talking about boasting about tomorrow, very clear there. He's saying your life is a vapor. You don't have any intrinsic staying power and permanence that you can cling on to. Instead, you should speak of the Lord's will. You should look through the lens of what God wishes, because He is this all-powerful controller of things. And then in chapter 5, even the things that we think are powerful, the things that we think give us some kind of security and ability, our savings account, the things that we've stored up for ourselves, our ability to manipulate the world around us, he says that's all going to come to an end. That's all impermanent as well. That'll end up moth-eaten and corroded, and it's not going to last. And you ultimately will be judged. If you have used those things wickedly, if you've lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury and fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter, then, well, that's going to come back against you. So, there is some common link between them. More than anything, though, if we just consider in context of what we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. Go back to chapter 3, and the last section of chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. We saw characterizations of worldly wisdom and wisdom that is from above, godly wisdom, one that's from above, one that's from below. Give me a sense, an overarching sense of how do we know, how can we really identify when it is wisdom from above? What are some of the primary characteristics that James is talking about here?
It is written.
Okay. Comes from God. It has a divine source. How do we really recognize it when we see it? Betty? Okay. The things he starts talking about here in verse 17. Merciful, without partiality, that kind of party spirit that we saw before. Peaceable, gentle. All this contrasted against what he began that section with, really going back even up further into chapter 3. The envy, the self-seeking, the selfish ambition, that is the hallmark of worldly wisdom. So when he's talking about wisdom which is from above, true wisdom, divine, godly wisdom, how do you know it? What does it look like? It's humble. It doesn't involve itself in self. It's not self-seeking. So we saw that in verses 13 through 18. This godly wisdom that leads to a good life, the good conduct. If you are wise, you might become a teacher, as he starts in chapter 3. That's one path. You need to be careful if you have wisdom and understanding about becoming a teacher. What you can definitely do and what you should and what you must do if you think you have any wisdom whatsoever, live this good life that he's talking about. And what does it look like? It's humble, it makes peace, it sows peace and reaps that harvest of righteousness. It is involved in that peacemaking, that gentleness, that humility. So that's godly wisdom. Well, in chapter 4, the first 10 verses that we looked at last week, and maybe a little bit the week before, that wisdom that's marked by a lack of selfish ambition that seeks peace, well, sometimes that's fractured, and you end up with wars and strife. You find yourself even at enmity with God. How's that overcome? Gives sort of the same advice, just phrased differently by the end. Humble yourselves in the sight of God. Humble yourselves before Him. He will be the one who uplifts. He gives grace to the humble, but He resists the proud. That's the advice. That's the cure to all of this. Submit to God. Humble yourself before God, and He will lift you up. That's where things ended in verse 10. And then we begin with these 3 paragraphs where essentially then what we're getting to are 3 sort of danger areas where self can assert itself and surface in these destructive ways, where we must truly develop a humble mindset and the according high estimation of God, those 2 things that seem to always be linked together. So here in these 3 ways, we can see that self manifesting, surfacing again, and bringing with it some bad things. In verses 11 and 12, my arrogance in speaking against a brother, what I say about others. Secondly, verses 13 through 17, my presumptuousness, and maybe even some greed mixed with that as well, but especially my presumptuousness in ordering my life and ordering my plans. And then in the beginning of chapter 5, my covetousness in trying to amass and trying to hoard up all these material goods and leverage them against other people. All the things that we're going to see in these next 3 paragraphs deal with a problem of self. They deal with a problem of selfishness and me asserting my power where it should not be, me trying to think more highly of myself than I should. So that's really what we'll be looking at here in these next 3 little sections. Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
We need to define what evil is in these 3 instances. It isn't when you criticize someone and you do it in a manner that is loving. That's edification.
Okay.
That's not evil. take that same thing and say it to someone else and whisper it to them and do it in a way that is critical, that's evil.
Okay.
There's a difference.
All right, well, let's get into the idea that we're talking about here, that Gary has mentioned in verse 11. And, well, I guess that phrase is only mentioned in verse 11, but 11 and 12 are dealing with it. Speaking evil of one another. What does that actually mean? What is it to speak evil of someone? As Gary has rightly pointed out, I think, it is not simply to say something critical of someone. In the same way we might think of, well, that means anything that you might say that isn't 100% praise, approval of what I'm doing, tell me that I'm wonderful, tell me that I'm right, tell me that I'm doing exactly as I should. If you don't do that, if you don't say something good about me, then you're doing this. You're speaking evil of me. Well, that's not what James is talking about. That's not what we're dealing with. That's not what speaking evil of someone is. Maybe there is as well, as Gary has mentioned, an idea of who are we saying it to? The feeling that we get from this, at least, it isn't necessarily spelled out here, but a lot of times it comes about in this way, that a lot of the evil speaking we do about someone is not evil speaking to that person. It is about them to someone else. Some people will say terrible things to your face, and, well, maybe we're thankful for those people because they at least show us who they are and they at least let you know how they feel. But by percentage, probably most evil speech that happens in the world is done to a third party, is done to someone else. You complain to someone else about how terrible they are. You pass gossip onto someone else about what you saw so-and-so doing. It's always going to, well, again, not always, it's often going to happen in the company of someone else. What other ideas are we thinking of? What is this when James is talking about speaking evil of someone? Ian? Okay. Okay, what's the purpose behind it? What am I trying to accomplish with this? I have, when it's evil speech, I mean, that translation's kind of giving away the game there. It's evil. My intention is bad. My intention is malicious. I have in mind something that is either going to help me or hurt them, or maybe both if it's an enemy. If it's someone that I want to bring down, then I can tear them down a little bit and make myself feel better or seem better to someone else or whatever it might be, and I have that bad intention in mind. Counter to, as Gary was pointing out a moment ago, I am very much capable of saying something critical to someone with love, with concern for them, truly saying to them, look, you're not doing right when you do this. You should stop this for your own sake. You should stop this because I love you. You need to quit this. That isn't evil speech. That's loving speech. That can be a gentle correction. Yes, we understand there are things that would moderate how we are supposed to do that and time and place and whatever else it might be, but that's a distinct possibility. Evil speaking is not that. It has an evil goal in mind. Now, Ian's also pointed out the idea of maybe truth versus falsehood. Is it possible to say something true and be speaking evil against someone? I think it very much is. I think, as mentioned, when do you say it? In the same way that at times we can try to hide behind saying, well, I'm just a straight shooter, I'm just telling the truth. I'm just telling it like it is. You know me, I'm one of those people who's honest all the time, and we kind of use that as something in our favor, as though this is my virtue, that I'm just unfiltered and raw and honest. But really what that means is that I'm just going to vomit out whatever comes into my mind, and if it hurts you or if it damages your influence before someone who did not need to hear anything about that, then, well, so be it. I'm just telling the truth. Really the idea, and literally I suppose what James is saying here, that speaking evil of is actually saying speaking against, or also can literally be translated as speaking down. That preposition there is against or down. And maybe we can picture it best that way as an attack from above. Picture someone who has planted themselves in an advantageous position. It's a sniper from the rooftop. It's an enemy who has entrenched themselves in a fortress. They're up above. They're in a defensible position, and they're just lobbing these attacks down on kind of the defenseless adversary who is trying to take shelter from it, but they're letting loose from above. They're speaking down. They're speaking against. They're speaking evil in that way. It's an uncharitable attack. The primary wrong here isn't that we're slandering someone with an untruth, but that we are arrogantly, with no humility, with no concern, with no love, attacking someone for the sake of attacking them, speaking evil. And he mingles this in the second phrase with judging a brother. Whoever speaks evil of his brother and judges his brother. Again, we understand this is not talking about discernment. This is talking about the harsh condemnation, the castigation, the kind of excoriating, blistering, withering judgment that we reserve for people who aren't myself. And this, James says, is foolish. It is wrong. It is an evil. So, the problem here, or I guess some of the things that we need to work through, and some have kind of organized this as far as our mindset, or how we view, how we regard certain things. First of all, how do we regard each other? Notice in verse 11, a three-time repetition of the idea of brethren, or being a brother. This is not language that James is shy about. He includes this often to kind of inject some of his more challenging themes with some of the warmth that he does seemingly feel for his readers. But don't speak evil of one another, brethren. But then he reminds us, who are we speaking against? Who am I truly speaking evil of in this scenario? A brother. And he repeats that twice. You have three of these mentions there in the first verse of the fact that these are brethren. These are family members. These are people with the same blood, the people with the same father who are doing this to one another. He finishes the section in the end in verse 12. New King James just says another, but really I think the best manuscripts are saying there, a neighbor. He does this towards a neighbor. Who are you to judge your neighbor? God, he says in verse 12, and maybe here's a kind of subtle reminder of what's going on or what we're truly doing. He says there's one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. So who are you to judge a neighbor? If it's my brother that I'm dealing with, I'm a Christian. He's a Christian. What was the lawgiver's choice? What is the lawgiver's choice with my brother? Save or destroy? Not a trick question, not a rhetorical. Okay, God's choosing to save. He's a brother. We're in Christ. God has made his view of the situation plain. I'm saving him. But I'm going to go, destroy, attack, condemn, judge, speak evil against. God has his view, but I'm going to do something different. I'm going to go a different way. Hey, maybe he missed the mark on this one, right? I'll get it right, and I'll tell everybody how crummy this guy is. Hopefully we see the foolishness there. It's my brother. Why would I defame him? Well, in similar fashion, think in verse 12. And Alec Motyer brings this point out. I think this is a very good consideration. In that idea of the neighbor, let's consider for a moment that, again, as we talked about, the problem here, speaking evil against, doesn't even seem to be that I'm spreading falsehoods about somebody. That here I have this, good, noble sort of paragon in the church, and I'm going and trying to make everybody think that he did something he didn't, or that he's not as good as people think he is, or whatever it is. Maybe I know of someone who really is sinning and really is struggling with things that they should not be doing. And they really do have black marks against them. Now I can judge and speak evil of them and spread it all over the church and spread it all over town. And that's what I would do with someone who has fallen into a dangerous situation, has fallen into enemy hands. I just speak evil of them. But what does one very famous neighbor do? In the parable that Jesus tells of the Good Samaritan, when asked this question, who is my neighbor? He tells a story of a man who falls into enemy hands, who is beaten and robbed and left for dead, and a neighbor happens upon him. And he decides to speak evil of him and kick him when he's down and say, hey, you got what you deserve, Jewish dog. I'm a Samaritan. We hate each other. I hope this happens to everybody like you. And then he goes back to his people and says, man, you wouldn't believe what I saw. Boy, it was great. I saw this Jew who'd been beaten up, and he was covered in blood, and they took everything that he had, and man, he got what was coming to him, and he doesn't take that tack at all. Here, seeing someone who is in peril, someone who is truly struggling, the neighbor builds him up. The neighbor lifts him out of that. He helps him out of the trouble. He tries to get him back onto his feet. He tries to heal him. That's what a neighbor does. That's what a brother does. That's not what someone who is speaking evil against someone is doing. And so hopefully we see a good contrast between those ideas. Gary.
If you look at the example in Galatians 2, when Paul confronts Peter about his behavior, he did it in a way that helped Peter. And that's a good thing. The kind of thing we ought to be doing if we're going to talk against somebody or tell them that what they're doing is wrong. They need to do it in a way that helps them, not defeats them.
Right. How do we do it, and to what end do we do it? Those are really the questions that we have to answer before we have that conversation. Why am I doing this? Is it to defeat them, or is it to help them? I think a good point there. David?
God has set up a pattern.
Yeah.
These words are more done with an intent to harm,
Yes.
not to bring that person to a knowledge of the truth.
Yeah. That's exactly what he's talking about here. It is, as we've said, it is just with the intent to destroy. It's an attack. All right, well, if I'm doing that, if I'm speaking evil of my brother, all right, it's clear then how I regard him, not as I should, not as a brother and a neighbor. I'm missing that. Well, how do I regard the law if that's what's going on? Not very well, apparently. And James says that by doing this, you speak evil of a brother and judge your brother. You speak evil of the law and judge the law. How is that true? What does that mean when James is telling us this. In what sense do I speak evil against the law here? Ian?
Put yourself in God's place.
Okay.
He's the one who's in charge of that. The pride back from the fall, where God said, "Don't eat that." He said, "Well, but it looks pretty good. I think I'll do it anyway. I'm going to do what I want to do, not what you told me to do." So when we put ourselves in that position, we're trying to take on the throne of God, and you're not equipped for that.
Okay. The law says this, but surely I know better. Surely I've figured out a better way, a different way. David?
Matthew 7:12. Do to others as you would have them do to you.
Yeah. Okay. The law and the prophets, and even if we stick in James, what has he said is the royal law? That you love one another. That's how you fulfill the royal law. So when James has talked about the law before, he has summarized it much as Jesus had, that it's in love toward one another, which clearly is absent if I'm doing what he's talking about here, speaking evil against and judging one another. So, I'm breaking the law. I'm clearly not a doer of the law. He says at the end of verse 2, if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. So instead of having my attitude be that what God has said, I'm going to do. All this goes back to chapter 1. Be not a hearer only. Hearing is where it starts. Be a hearer of the law. Be a doer of the law. And that should be my attitude, right? I submit to God. That means I'm going to do what He wants me to do. I'm going to listen to His voice. Well, here, this is a rapid reversal from that, isn't it? You're not a doer of the law. You've put yourself in the position of being a judge of the law. Not only are you not doing what God told you to do, you're saying, I don't need to do that. I figured out something better. I'm going to do something that surpasses the law. That's obviously, we see the foolishness within this. All right, well, that ties into the third, which is how we view God. We've all kind of mentioned this already. We're attempting, in speaking evil against my brother, really what I'm attempting to do is usurping the power of God, the authority of God. He's the lawgiver. The law, as we've talked about before here in James, really the most horrific thing about being in violation of the laws of God is not that we have stepped past something that God arbitrarily told us to do or not to do. But by breaking a law of God, God has given those laws to explain Himself, to explain His character, who He is, what He wants, what His preferences are, what His view of things is, which is what reality is. But the law of God sketches out in our minds, it displays to us who God is. That is what His voice to us does. That's how we know who He is, through what He's communicated to us. So if the law of God explains His character and I say, well, I don't want to do that, I don't think I should do that, I think that what you're telling me is foolish and stupid and I'm above that, what am I saying about not just the law, but God Himself? I'm standing in judgment of God and evaluating my opinion, my will over His commands, over His law, over His authority. This is dangerous territory. The final idea then is, well, if this is the case, if I'm speaking evil against my brother, how do I view myself? And that's kind of the question James wants to ask in the end too. Who are you to judge your neighbor? Who do you think you are? Is the sort of rhetorical question here. But let's make it not rhetorical. Let's really consider, where do you truly slot yourself into the sort of hierarchy in things between God and yourself and the people around you? What level in that do you occupy? Are you right at the top of that? Or maybe even it's God, and then a little below that is you, who can kind of cast the judgment down on everyone else. You're kind of His right-hand man. Who are you exactly? Who are you to judge your neighbor? What is the view we have of ourselves? Again, if we don't divorce this from its context, but if we put this with everything James has been telling us before, I think it becomes very clear what our need is. If you've humbled yourself in the sight of the Lord, if you have accepted true godly wisdom that is peace and humility and mercy, then I understand I'm not anyone who needs to be judging my neighbor, who needs to be speaking evil against my brother. All right, comments, questions, anything else here on verses 11 and 12? Okay, crystal clear. I love it. Let's begin in verse 13. I say that like I didn't take 30 minutes to talk about 2 verses. Yes, it should be clear at the end, right? Verses 13 through 17 then, this kind of next idea that we're looking at. Presumption. Another area where self comes to the forefront, where we show our arrogance. Here he is talking about a man. Well, let's read these verses together real quick, actually, short section. James 4:13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It's even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. All right, here's the presumption. And really, there are several things involved here. What is this hypothetical guy in James's passage here? What things is he taking for granted that should not and ultimately cannot be taken for granted? What's he presuming upon? Yeah, Ian?
That he is in complete control. He's focused only on his material possessions, and he's not taking a view towards eternity or spiritual things.
Okay. One idea there, his control, that he has complete control over things, that it's all his choice. He says, I'm going to go and trade, and, well, I mean, that's just what I'm going to do. And make a profit. Okay. There's another idea that he's presuming upon, his ability, his success in that. And spend a year and not die in that intervening year, or not have some emergency that comes up that says, I got to go back home and go somewhere else. I got sick and I need to go here. Or my friend needs me in this place and I need to go do that. Or it turns out I'm actually a moron and I'm not good at buying and selling, and so I failed and I need to go back home and go do something else. There are a lot of assumptions or presumptions being made here, beginning with life itself, that it will continue indefinitely at my will, and that if I say I'm going to live another year, then I'm going to live this year. No ifs, ands, or buts. Bring it on 2026. I'm going to be there for the whole thing. Why? Because I said so. He's presuming upon, as we said, his choice. The idea that external factors, that no other factor might come up that would impede my ability to do as I've determined. And presuming upon that ability, that he's going to make a profit, that this will be successful. Again, why? Because I said so. I mean, how could it go wrong? It's what I've planned. It's what I've determined. It's inconceivable that I would fail. Now we see James already beginning with some of the irony, where in verse 13 he's talking about a man who decides he's going to go spend a year doing this, and he says in verse 14, you don't know what will happen tomorrow. You're talking about 300 plus days from now. You don't know one day in the future what's going to happen. How in the world are you getting to this leap to a year when you know nothing about the next 24 hours? Well, the point of this passage, the takeaway is not meant to be against planning, okay? Don't plan anything out in advance because you never know what will happen. Just, go through life figure it out as it comes, and, because it'd be presumptuous to do anything else. All right, that ignores a lot of Scripture that says exactly the contrary, the need for wisdom. It would, in fact, be presumptuous to think, well, I'm going to be a reckless fool, and I'll let everyone else take care of me when I inevitably fall into difficulty, because I will if I don't try to plan anything out. That's its own kind of presumption. The point of this is not to give us the magical talisman that wards against all of this, where if I just end every sentence where I'm talking about plans by saying, God willing, well, then I've taken care of things on that front, and I can kind of just go about in my mind as I normally would. Well, I said if God wills at the end of something when I told you what I'm going to do tomorrow, and so that takes care of it. That's the magic charm. The point is simply that when you make a plan, when you consider what's coming next, that you do it in view of God, that you do it in view of His greater power, which is so far beyond yours. We who are temporary, who are a vapor, who is here for a little time and then vanishes away, that you plan in view of God and in view of our obvious weakness and ignorance and impermanence. That's what he's just trying to tell us here. Don't think that you have everything figured out and have total control over everything. If anyone controls things, it is God. And so you submit to Him. You have humility in your life and submit to God, and He will lift you up, and He will take care of you, and He will see to your plans. But you take care of that idea first. Ian.
Along those lines, I have a relative, I haven't seen in years, I don't know if they still do this, but they would tack on, like, Lord willing, at the beginning or end of, anytime they just were making plans. And they were coming from a position of fear. They were generally afraid.
Yeah.
That God was going to smite them if they said they're going on a picnic this weekend and they didn't say, Lord willing. And yeah, one time, I kind of had some of that gnawing at me earlier in my life as well. I just said, Lord, any plans I make, they're submitted to you. And so God's not just waiting for you to kind of forget to dot your I's so that you avoid your contract. This is, as you said, having a spirit of humility and knowing that we are not in control and that God is in charge of everything.
Yeah. It is much more mindset than speech pattern. It is much more in how we actually order and plan our lives than it is making sure to include the proper verbiage every time we talk about anything. Because we'd have to say, all right, I can look everywhere else in Scripture and find people who make all kinds of plans, godly people who say all kinds of things they're going to do, and they don't say that at the end of their plans. I mean, when Paul talks about going on some journey, he doesn't finish with saying this every time. Well, because that's not the point. The point is that he's clearly doing what God wills, what God wants him to do. And if we do the same, then it will be obvious in our lives as well, one would hope. Tim?
Well, the model prayer, it also says, thy will be done. And then we always have the Lord willing and the creeks don't rise.
Right.
Someone else involved in it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Gary.
Jesus tells us about a man in the Gospels that had reaped such abundance that he was going to have to tear down his barns and build new barns and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And Jesus called him a fool for obvious reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, he is a good example of exactly this mindset, isn't he? A man who says, here's what I'm going to do next, here's what should come up. And the problem, again, in that parable that Jesus tells of the rich fool, isn't that this guy was successful, that he wanted to build a new barn. I mean, there's nothing wrong with building a new barn. There's nothing wrong with having a good crop. But this man, Jesus says, wasn't rich toward God. Didn't give any thought to anything else. He's foolish because he is simply presuming upon the fact that I will always be able to live to do that. I have total control. What I deem important is of greatest importance. And he's absent in thinking of God. All right, another note to mention here, that James depicts consideration of God in what we would maybe deem a secular area. That he is talking about my business and where I'm going to go and live and where I'm going to buy and sell. it's maybe interesting and worth noting, worth perceiving here, that in this totally non-religious setting, that is where James is saying you've got to consider God. He isn't saying when you're in church and praying and all these kinds of things, then you think of God. When you're determining where to worship or what your practice is going to be in worship, then you consider God. No, he's saying in all areas of life, on the basic, fundamental, day-to-day, Monday through Saturday type activities, that's also when you consider God. That doesn't just come about when we are here all together in our Sunday best, saying religious things and doing religious things. No, you ought always to say, if the Lord wills, we will live to do this or that. Verses 16 and 17 really kind of drive home the importance or the seriousness of what he's talking about. First of all, by saying in verse 16 that this is boasting in arrogance, that this is an exercise of pride. And that pride that is mentioned there is always evil. It is always something that is spoken of in a negative sense. And I mean, the translation given there in the New King James, arrogance, I mean, that paints it pretty well for us. Some people consider that a virtue or consider that a good quality, especially more and more, I suppose, in our culture. And there are other civilizations that have felt that way towards pride and estimation of oneself. But biblically speaking, this is always bad. This is always a negative thing. It's always evil. It's always spoken of in that way and depicted that way, to have this kind of pride. That's what he's saying here. You boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. It always is. All such. Every time that happens, when you have that view of self, it's always bad. It's always dangerous territory. So the answer is a carefully ordered life, a mindful life. We don't presume upon our time, our choices, our abilities that we may not have. We follow God. We do what He wills. Do what is good while you can. All right. We will pick up there next week. Maybe have a little bit more to say about verse 15 before we move on.